He was the man who claimed you could build a world-class body in minutes, not hours. The bodybuilder who believed logic and philosophy could outlift brute force. Yet despite his revolutionary ideas and supreme confidence, his story ended far too soon and far too mysteriously. This is the tale of Mike Mentzer, the underdog who rose to bodybuilding's elite, defied every tradition, and then watched it all collapse in a storm of controversy, obsession, and tragedy. In this video, we'll uncover the rise, the training revolution, the shocking 1980 showdown that changed everything, the downfall that followed, and the haunting questions that still surround his untimely death. Mike Mentzer's story began on November 15, 1951, in Germantown, Philadelphia, a city known for its blue-collar toughness and relentless work ethic. It was the perfect birthplace for a man who would later redefine what discipline truly meant. From a young age, Mentzer showed signs that he was wired differently. While other kids were content with sports or hanging out after school, Mike was buried in books and barbells. At just 11 years old, he started lifting weights in his family's basement, inspired by muscle magazines featuring the likes of Steve Reeves and Bill Pearl. But this wasn't just about looking good, it was an intellectual pursuit. He treated training like a science experiment. Every rep, every set was recorded, analyzed, and refined. By the time he was in high school, he was already bench pressing impressive weights and drawing attention for his symmetrical, powerful physique. Unlike many of his peers who followed gym folklore or bro science, Mentzer's approach was almost academic. He devoured everything he could about physiology, nutrition, and exercise theory. In fact, before fully committing to bodybuilding, he studied pre-medical courses at the University of Maryland, planning to become a psychiatrist. That background in science and the human mind would later shape how he viewed training and life itself. His hard work paid off spectacularly. In 1976, Mike won the Mr. America title, a huge milestone that marked him as one of the sport's brightest young stars. His body wasn't just massive, it was balanced. Proportion, symmetry, and definition made him look like a sculpted blueprint of human potential. But it was his 1978 Mr. Universe victory that cemented his place in bodybuilding history. Scoring a perfect 300 out of 300, Mentzer became the first and only man ever to achieve that feat. For many, it was a validation of both his physique and his philosophy. The crowd was in awe, the judges couldn't find a flaw, and his rivals realized they were witnessing something rare, a man who had mastered both muscle and mind. The following year, Mentzer's momentum carried him into the professional ranks. In 1979, he won the heavyweight division of the Mr. Olympia, sharing the stage with legends like Frank Zane and Chris Dickerson. Many predicted that within a year or two, Mentzer would be the next undisputed champion. He wasn't just a competitor, he was seen as the evolution of bodybuilding. And it wasn't just his victories that drew attention. It was his attitude. Mike Mentzer was bold, outspoken, and unapologetically confident. While most athletes stuck to cliché answers, Mike spoke like a philosopher. He quoted Ayn Rand, debated training logic, and challenged bodybuilding's sacred cows. He believed success was about rational thinking, not blind repetition, and he wasn't afraid to say it on camera. His revolutionary heavy-duty system reflected that mindset. Influenced by Arthur Jones, the inventor of the Nautilus machines, Mentzer argued that less could be more, that shorter, high-intensity workouts performed to absolute muscular failure could produce better results than the marathon sessions that dominated the gym culture of the 1970s. His theory was simple but radical. Work hard, not long. This approach was both praised and mocked. Some called him a genius. Others said he was lazy or arrogant. But what no one could deny was that his results were undeniable. His physique was proof of concept. Mike wasn't trying to fit in. He was trying to redefine bodybuilding. And for a while, it seemed like nothing could stop him. The competitions, the fame, the endorsements. Mentzer was on a trajectory that looked unstoppable. But behind the trophies and the philosophy, there were cracks beginning to form. Because in a sport driven by politics, ego, and image, logic doesn't always win. And for Mike Mentzer, that harsh truth was about to hit harder than any weight he'd ever lifted. The 1980 Mr. Olympia and the turning point. The year was 1980, and the bodybuilding world was about to witness one of its most explosive, polarizing, and talked about contests in history. The Mr. Olympia in Sydney, Australia. For Mike Mentzer, it wasn't just another competition. It was supposed to be his crowning moment. The night his years of discipline, intellect, and intensity would finally pay off with the most coveted title in the sport. Mentzer arrived in Sydney at the height of his powers. His physique was otherworldly, dense, symmetrical, and chiseled with mathematical precision. Every muscle seemed sculpted by a man who not only trained his body but engineered it. Fans and experts alike predicted he would finally take the throne from reigning legends like Frank Zane and Chris Dickerson. This was to be the moment the cerebral revolutionary, the man who believed in shorter, smarter workouts, would prove his heavy-duty philosophy against the traditional high-volume giants of the game. But just days before the competition, a shockwave hit the bodybuilding world. Arnold Schwarzenegger, the six-time Mr. Olympia who had retired 5 years earlier to pursue a Hollywood career, suddenly announced that he would be stepping out of retirement to compete that very weekend. His entry came without months of preparation, without any official announcement, and yet his presence instantly changed everything. For Mike and the other competitors, it felt like the rules had shifted overnight. Arnold wasn't just another contestant. He was the face of bodybuilding, the global icon. His charisma and status loomed so large that his surprise return felt less like competition and more like a coronation in waiting. Behind the stage, tensions flared. According to several athletes, including Mentzer himself, heated arguments broke out during the competitors' meeting. Some claimed the judging panel was already biased. Others feared the event had become a publicity stunt designed to boost Arnold's fame, just as Conan the Barbarian was about to hit theaters. When the big night arrived, the energy inside the Sydney Opera House was electric, but uneasy. The crowd buzzed with anticipation, yet there was a quiet suspicion that the result had already been decided. The posing routines were fierce. Mentzer's presentation was clinical and exact, crisp, powerful, and calculated. Arnold, on the other hand, leaned on charisma and stage presence. His physique, while still impressive, lacked the sharpness and definition of his prime years. Still, his confidence and charm filled the room like a tidal wave. And then came the decision. When the announcer declared Arnold Schwarzenegger the 1980 Mr. Olympia, the audience erupted. Not in celebration, but in confusion. Some cheered, many booed. Others stood in stunned silence. Mike Mentzer, who tied for 4th-5th place, was visibly furious. So were other competitors, including Boyer Coe, Chris Dickerson, and even Frank Zane, who later admitted he believed the judging was unfair. Mentzer didn't hold back. He called the event a farce, claiming it was predetermined to favor Arnold for commercial and political reasons. To him, it was proof that bodybuilding had traded integrity for marketability. Years later, he would recall that night with bitterness, calling it the moment when the sport I loved lost its soul. It wasn't just about losing, it was about how he lost. Mentzer, the perfectionist, had built his life around logic, fairness, and results. But here, in front of the world, none of that mattered. The better man, in his eyes, didn't win. And that realization shattered something inside him. At just 29 years old, Mike Mentzer made a decision that shocked the bodybuilding community. He walked away. No farewell tour, no comeback. He retired from competitive bodybuilding completely, turning his back on a sport that had defined his entire life. It was a bold move, but also a painful one. Because while Mike left the stage behind, he couldn't leave behind the resentment, the questions, and the feeling that he had been cheated. Those emotions would follow him for the rest of his life, shaping his next chapter, one filled with rebellion, brilliance, and ultimately deep struggle. That single night in 1980 didn't just mark the end of Mike Mentzer's career. It became the turning point that set off a slow, tragic descent. What began as a protest against corruption would spiral into years of inner conflict and isolation. Because walking away from the sport wasn't the end of Mike Mentzer's story. It was the beginning of a battle, not with other competitors this time, but with himself. Life after competition. When Mike Mentzer walked off the competitive stage in 1980, many assumed it was the end of his story. But for Mike, it was a rebirth. He wasn't the kind of man to fade quietly into the background. The fire that had once driven him to sculpt one of the most disciplined physiques in bodybuilding now burned toward a different mission: to educate, to provoke thought, and to reshape the way the world understood strength. He channeled his disappointment with the sport into his next great pursuit: writing and teaching. In the years that followed, Mentzer became one of the most outspoken intellectuals in the fitness world. He wrote prolifically for bodybuilding magazines such as Iron Man and Muscle and Fitness, where his columns stood out for their mix of scientific rigor and philosophical depth. He wasn't interested in rep counts or protein shakes. He wanted to discuss logic, ethics, and the psychology of achievement. Then came his life's work, the Heavy Duty series of books. The first, Heavy Duty, and later Heavy Duty 2, Mind and Body, went far beyond typical workout guides. These weren't just fitness manuals. They were blueprints for rational living, written by a man who believed that physical excellence and mental clarity were inseparable. He presented training as a science of stimulus and recovery, a carefully measured cause and effect. To Mentzer, spending hours in the gym was not discipline. It was irrationality disguised as effort. His core message was simple, but revolutionary. Train less, think more, perform fewer sets, but make each one count. Push to the absolute limit, then let the body rest and grow. It was an approach that turned conventional bodybuilding wisdom upside down, and it divided the community like few philosophies ever had. While many mocked his ideas as too extreme or unproven, others found liberation in his logic. His heavy-duty system gave permission to bodybuilders who were burnt out from marathon training sessions, and it offered a sense of structure, science, and sanity in a sport often driven by superstition. Soon, Mentzer developed a loyal following of thinkers, rebels, and misfits, who saw him not just as a trainer, but as a teacher. But Mike's intellect didn't stop at muscle. His fascination with Ayn Rand's objectivism became the intellectual backbone of his life. He read Rand's works obsessively and adopted her principles of rational self-interest, individualism, and reason as moral virtue. In interviews, he quoted Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead as easily as he could recite muscle anatomy. To him, bodybuilding was philosophy in motion, a way to physically demonstrate the power of the mind to dominate nature and limitation. He once said, "Bodybuilding is the ultimate expression of man's rational will to shape matter, to control reality, to create himself." It was an idea that resonated with many, but also made him a polarizing figure. Some admired his brilliance, others dismissed him as arrogant or out of touch. Even so, his influence was undeniable. One of those deeply influenced by his teachings was Dorian Yates, who would later become a six-time Mr. Olympia champion in the 1990s. Yates credited Mentzer's heavy-duty system for reshaping his training philosophy, trading endless sets for brief, brutal intensity. Dorian called Mentzer's logic a revelation, saying it gave him clarity on how to train harder and smarter. Through Yates, Mentzer's methods finally reached the Olympia stage, not under his own name, but through the body of another man who carried his torch. But while his ideas were taking root in the fitness world, Mentzer himself was fighting quiet battles behind the scenes. The money that once came easily during his competitive years had dried up. His name, once celebrated on magazine covers, had faded into the background of a new generation obsessed with mass monsters and supplements. He struggled with financial hardship, living modestly and sometimes relying on personal training clients to get by. He also faced deep personal loss. His brother Ray, who was both his best friend and training partner, had his own health struggles that weighed heavily on Mike. The two were inseparable, both geniuses in their own right, but their bond would later be marked by tragedy. And then there was the emotional toll. Friends and colleagues began noticing erratic behavior, intense mood swings, and paranoia. Some attributed it to exhaustion, others to years of stimulant use from his competition days. Whatever the cause, the man once known for his logic and precision began to lose control over the very mind he had built his identity upon. Still, even in those darker moments, Mike's intellect shone through. In interviews, he spoke with clarity and conviction, weaving together physiology and philosophy, as if they were two sides of the same coin. But behind the calm voice and analytical words, something was breaking. Mike Mentzer had spent his whole life proving that reason could conquer chaos. But as the years went on, the chaos grew louder, and reason wasn't always enough to silence it. Because while the world still saw Mike as the philosopher of muscle, behind the curtain, he was fighting battles far heavier than any barbell he had ever lifted. And in the next chapter of his story, those battles would begin to take over, leading him down a path few could have imagined. Struggles, controversies, and decline. After the 1980 Mr. Olympia fallout, Mike Mentzer's world began to unravel. The man who once stood as bodybuilding's sharpest mind and most promising star was now caught between bitterness, financial ruin, and a fading spotlight. In the years that followed, his life became a mix of genius, obsession, and slow decline. According to reports, Mentzer's income plummeted from an estimated $200,000 a year, a fortune for a bodybuilder in the 1970s, to virtually nothing after his abrupt retirement. The sponsorships dried up. The magazine features stopped coming. The seminars and guest appearances that once kept him busy began to vanish. For a man who had built his identity on rational control and self-sufficiency, the loss of stability was devastating. Still, Mike tried to reinvent himself through writing, coaching, and personal training, but the bodybuilding world was moving on. The flashy, mass-driven era of the 1980s, dominated by names like Lee Haney, had no patience for Mentzer's intellectual approach or his minimalist training philosophy. To many, his heavy-duty system sounded more like rebellion than science. His 20-minute workouts and one-set-to-failure approach were mocked by mainstream trainers who labeled them gimmicks. Critics claimed his theories ignored volume, nuance, and individual variability, accusing him of trying to turn the art of bodybuilding into an equation. But while the debate raged on in public, the real battle was happening in private. Mentzer was slipping deeper into personal turmoil. He struggled with severe depression, bouts of anxiety, and what friends later described as erratic, manic behavior. His close associates claimed that he sometimes disappeared for days, neglecting clients and missing deadlines. Rumors circulated about amphetamine use, reportedly starting in the late 1970s when he relied on stimulants to sustain his long hours editing for Muscle Builder magazine and preparing for competitions. According to several accounts, the habit carried into his later years, contributing to sleeplessness and paranoia. One of the most haunting anecdotes came from fellow bodybuilder Tom Platz, who recalled seeing Mike during his final years looking like a shadow of the man he used to be. Platz described finding Mentzer laying there like a drunken guy outside a gym, exhausted, disoriented, and far removed from the intellectual powerhouse who once challenged Arnold himself. The image was heartbreaking. The man who taught millions how to train smarter couldn't seem to control the chaos within himself. By the early 1990s, Mentzer's reputation had become polarizing. Some still saw him as a misunderstood genius, a prophet ahead of his time. Others dismissed him as a cautionary tale of what happens when obsession turns inward. His philosophical certainty, once his greatest weapon, now alienated those closest to him. Friends said conversations with Mike had become unpredictable. He could shift from deep philosophical lectures to furious rants about betrayal and corruption in the industry. Even so, he refused to give up entirely. Mentzer continued training clients, publishing essays, and mentoring anyone willing to listen. But the spark that once made him a symbol of discipline and reason was dimming. The years of stress, stimulant use, and isolation had taken a visible toll on his health. Mike had spent his life building strength from logic, but now that logic was collapsing under the weight of his own demons. And soon that downward spiral would reach its tragic end, one that still leaves fans and historians wondering how such a brilliant mind could burn out so completely. Untimely death and aftermath. By the early 2000s, Mike Mentzer was living quietly in California, training clients, writing, and continuing to spread his heavy-duty message to a small but loyal circle of followers. Though the fame had long faded, he still carried himself with the same sense of conviction, that blend of intellect and stubbornness that had defined him since his youth. But beneath that calm exterior, his health was deteriorating rapidly. On June 10, 2001, tragedy struck. Mike Mentzer was found dead in his apartment at the age of 49. The official cause of death was listed as heart complications, likely a heart attack. For those who had followed his career, the news hit like a shockwave. The philosopher of muscle, the man who taught others how to train with precision and purpose, was gone far too soon. But in a cruel twist of fate, the tragedy didn't end there. Just 2 days later, Mike's younger brother Ray Mentzer, also a respected bodybuilder and his lifelong training partner, passed away in the same apartment. The back-to-back deaths stunned the bodybuilding world. It felt almost symbolic, as if the two brothers, inseparable in life, refused to part in death. Rumors quickly began to swirl. Some speculated that the brothers shared genetic heart conditions, which had silently worsened over time. Others pointed to Mike's history of amphetamine use, which can strain the heart when taken chronically. According to reports, traces of morphine were allegedly found during the autopsy, though whether it was prescribed or recreational remained unclear. Some even suggested that years of stress, emotional turmoil, and overwork had finally caught up to him. Whatever the cause, the loss was profound. The bodybuilding community mourned a man who had dared to challenge the establishment, who had refused to follow the crowd, even when it cost him everything. Fans around the world shared tributes, remembering the man who had transformed how they thought about training, intensity, and individuality. In the years since his passing, Mike Mentzer's legacy has only grown stronger. His heavy-duty philosophy, once dismissed as radical or unrealistic, is now studied, debated, and practiced by lifters around the world. His influence can be seen in every athlete who values recovery as much as effort, who seeks precision instead of chaos, who believes that the mind drives the muscle. Even modern champions like Dorian Yates and generations after him continue to credit Mentzer for shaping their understanding of true intensity. Though his life was cut short, Mike's impact never died. His story remains both inspiring and cautionary, a reminder that brilliance and burden often walk hand in hand. Because beyond the contest stage and the fame, Mike Mentzer's real legacy isn't just the muscle he built, it's the message he left behind. So what can we take from his life? Maybe that greatness isn't only about how much we can lift, but about what we learn when the weight becomes too heavy to bear. Decades after his death, Mike Mentzer's influence still pulses through the veins of modern bodybuilding. The heavy-duty system he pioneered forever changed how athletes approach training. Gone were the days when endless hours in the gym were considered the only path to greatness. Mike's philosophy, short, low-volume, high-intensity workouts with ample recovery time, redefined efficiency and forced a new generation to rethink the relationship between effort and growth. What was once seen as heresy is now science. Sports physiology has since confirmed much of what Mentzer preached, that recovery is not weakness, but strategy, that more isn't always better, that intensity, not duration, determines progress. In that sense, his work was prophetic, decades ahead of its time. But Mentzer's legacy isn't just about training principles. His life story stands as a warning about the thin line between ambition and obsession. His pursuit of perfection in body, mind, and philosophy became both his superpower and his undoing. Behind the rational structure of his heavy-duty system was a man who demanded the same precision from himself and the world around him. When that world disappointed him through politics, rejection, or injustice, the cracks began to show. His story speaks to something universal, the cost of chasing greatness. The toll it takes not just on the body, but on the mind. The quiet damage that comes from living under constant pressure to be exceptional. And in Mentzer's case, it raises deeper questions about mental health, addiction, and the emotional fallout of a life lived entirely in pursuit of an ideal. Even today, fans still debate the great what-ifs. What if Mike Mentzer hadn't walked away after the 1980 Olympia? Could he have come back stronger? Maybe even won the title that eluded him? Or was that night always destined to break him? And what about his own philosophy, the one that changed everything? Did his heavy-duty approach extend his career through efficiency, or shorten his life through unrelenting intensity? These are questions that may never be answered. because Mike Mentzer's story is both triumphant and tragic. A man who sought absolute control in a world that refused to play by his rules. The man who taught others how to train hard and think harder ultimately paid the heaviest price for his own relentless pursuit of perfection. But perhaps that's why his name still echoes. Not just in gyms or books, but in the hearts of anyone who's ever pushed themselves to the edge in search of greatness. So now I'll leave it to you. What do you think was the real turning point in Mike Mentzer's life? Was it the 1980 Olympia, his withdrawal from competition, or something deeper that we'll never fully understand? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because Mike's story isn't just about bodybuilding. It's about the fragile, fascinating line between genius and destruction. From his meteoric rise as one of bodybuilding's brightest stars, to his intellectual revolution that challenged every norm in the sport, to his heartbreaking collapse marked by struggle and loss, Mike Mentzer's story is one of brilliance, defiance, and tragedy. He lived as a man who demanded reason in a world driven by ego, who believed the body could be perfected through logic, and who refused to bow to the politics of the stage. His untimely death in 2001 may have ended his journey, but his legacy remains unshaken. Every time an athlete chooses intensity over volume, logic over tradition, or rest over burnout, they're echoing Mentzer's message. He was more than a bodybuilder, he was a thinker who dared to ask why when everyone else was busy asking how much. His body may be gone, but his ideas still echo in every gym where someone pushes to failure, takes days off, and refuses to just conform. If you found this story compelling, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the legends, controversies, and untold stories that shape the world of bodybuilding. And let us know in the comments, what do you think Mike Mentzer's story truly teaches us about strength, success, and the cost of perfection?